Alright, welcome to my fourth video. We could call it revision 4 rather than part 4. I'm always learning, always going back, trying to fix things that I've missed in other videos or just gaining knowledge as I go along. And a lot of the focus of my videos is really around the drawings, communications such as ciphers and the artworks in cards that the Zodiac sent into the media and to law enforcement. And I think it's quite interesting when we look at drafting holistically. And this old advert's great because it really bottles down what I think the skills that Zodiac have are and how he's demonstrating that in his communications. In my last videos, I've been through quite a lot on landscape architecture and that design side of things, as well as civil engineering, particularly around the bus bomb diagram sections. We've also looked at some electrical circuits, and underlying all of this is mechanical engineering, really. That's a lot of the textbooks, such as technical drawing. The foundation for that is really mechanical engineering. This job advert here, become a draftsperson, enjoy a real job in the industry, is really from around the 1930s and 40s when the car industry was booming. So of course it almost has this as a separate drafting line, automotive, but really that's mechanical and electrical engineering, but it's called out to do engines almost as something different. This advertisement's really interesting too because it shows a positioning of structural and civil engineering and architectural, which includes landscape architecture, into the environment. You can see the sky and buildings and infrastructure, land planning, land development, large infrastructure projects, whereas the electrical and mechanical engineering is far more internal, within factories, within cars, within machines. It's also really interesting to look at the era that Zodiac was operating in. Now, I've talked a lot about Berkeley and San Francisco in the late 60s, the counterculture, civil rights, this whole flourishing of design, culture, technology. And it's really interesting to start putting into context the space age that Zodiac was operating in. He talks about his bus bomb diagrams being masterpieces, and he shows off his artistic creations in his cards and ciphers and that mathematics. But we've also got to understand, balance and contrast that against the aeronautical engineering and the pursuits of space exploration and the engineering and design that would have gone into that. That he's not just competing with the local media, he's also competing with what's happening more generally in terms of design and engineering in this space age. And it's really easy to see how drafting played such a big role in that, because it's so different to today where so many things are done on computers. And I thought these drafting advertisements were quite interesting, particularly the way it talks about paying big money, because, well, some engineers can earn big money, but as a drafter, in its strict term, it doesn't pay that big. But you get 3 big drafting kits given to you. And this one's interesting too. It has the floor engineering advertisement. I wonder if that's the advertisement from this particular magazine that Don Chaney went for. So it's quite interesting when we look at drafting in this era that it would have been something along with the space race, along with automotive, along with this innovation that was happening, particularly in the late 60s with electronic engineering. You're going from tubes to transistors, almost into the digital realm into the 70s. Really quite an exciting time. And a lot of this was fairly specialized, such as doing engineering at a university level or planning. Some of it would be quite accessible, such as motoring and hobbyist level electronic magazines. And it's quite fascinating that in this time there was a lot of hobbyists that were into cars, into electronics, and there's some demonstration in Zodiac's communications that he was trying to do something important. He was certainly wanting to become famous, but how much technical ability he actually really had versus this hobbyist level is something we're going to explore in today's video. It's really interesting also when we look back through old ads and old textbooks and old magazines and journals and newspapers that it's really easy to fall into the trap of speaking about Zodiac in modern context or sensibility. But when we go back and have a look at a lot of the advertisements and the culture of the era, there was a different language that was used. There was a different way of advertising and a different way of talking that Zodiac certainly taps into. And I've spoken before that I believe he's more of a mature age student or someone who has recently graduated, not someone who's been working in a heavy duty profession for a long time, due to the mix match of what information he puts forward. Some of it's quite technical, some of it seems very hatched together, where he's used these various multimedia together to form this image. And during the 50s and the 60s, there was a need for crime solving. And I wonder if even Zodiac had seen some of these adverts or was influenced by the times. You know, jobs for fingerprinting to become a detective. You know, even this would challenge you to top this job for action, security, big pay, again, like the drafting, big pay. There was ample information to not only learn about crime, but to be involved. And I sometimes wonder if Zodiac might have been someone who could have been interested in doing something like that, but never pursued it. And just interesting, the vocabulary or the style of adverts. You know, here we've got almost a Blue Rock Springs or Lake Herman Road crime scene as an advertisement to join law enforcement. We've got all this talk about killing, and there was a lot of murder, there was a lot of crime, there was a lot of unrest in this time. You know, the city streets have become a battlefield where muggers and rapists run wild, and women are forced to learn how to maim and murder in self-defense. Well, murder in self-defense, that's pretty extreme. But anyway, I think this gives you an idea of what was really happening in that era and how important that was in creating the identity in the background or culture of Zodiac, in addition to other things I've mentioned, such as movies and comic books. Even in professional lighting advertisements, we've got this kind of focus on almost horror movies, or maybe even Red Mask. The underground press and some of the diagrams and influences that may have come out of that, as well as things that are applicable to general citizens and manufacturing, such as the automotive industry and detection and new technology used, such as the autotronic eye in Cadillacs. And as I went through in my last video, just looking at the complexity of geometry that's used throughout the documentation that Zodiac sends through, but also how it reveals the basic drafting knowledge that he would have had using triangular set squares, different types of templates, including circle templates, for example, to do the circle on the cross on the 13, card, and lettering templates such as this one down here and here. I'm not sure if he actually used a lettering template like this, but he may have used the circular wheel here on the left, which has guidelines for doing lettering at different spacings, which I'll go through later. There's also this contrast in Zodiac's documentation that I went through a bit on electrical engineering, and I'll go through more on electrical engineering in this video along with mechanical engineering. And in my last video I went through the university courses, or the core elements that would go towards creating an engineer or a designer. And it's really interesting to point out just how complex electrical engineering and mechanical engineering is in mathematics. It's incredibly mathematical. It's very heavy on chemistry, physics, and complex mathematics. The professions such as architecture, landscape architecture, land survey, much less so. That contrasts with the concept diagrams and concept art and crafts that the Zodiac prepared. The cute buses, the Halloween cards, the references to other cards that primarily include pen and ink or hand drawings, such as R. Crumb, the ciphers themselves and the layout for those ciphers, and the collage and creativity we see in some of his cards. So there's this real dynamic that, you know, if it was someone who was purely an engineer, you know, it's much rarer for engineers to have that right side of the brain, the artistic approach. In my experience, I've always been the one that goes to meetings with my felt tip pens and a roll of yellow trace to start drawing. The engineers turn up with calculators. And it's not to say that an engineer couldn't do these sorts of artworks. It's just when we look at it holistically, the Zodiac has a pattern that ranges quite wide from this spatial language and looking at land surveying and mapping and geography, very descriptive in spatial terms when he's describing his murders in the letters. The crime scenes themselves all at parks. They're never in a warehouse or in downtown side streets. They're all adjacent parks. At the same time, he does have some mathematical ability that comes through in cipher preparation and in general drafting, but there's not really any evidence of incredibly complex high-level mathematics. Now, we also went through the drawing equipment that Zodiac would need, and I focused last time particularly on some of the diagrams to demonstrate that it looks like he's done a draft with a drawing board first and then has done a final print up for his letters, ciphers, and cards. And this is common across all disciplines, engineering, architecture. Less so in terms of graphic design. I will go through a bit of graphic design in this video as well, because I've kind of missed out on that. But it's more likely that a drafter would have all this equipment naturally and would be able to utilize things like light tables and the drawing equipment that we see being utilized by Zodiac. And it's also worth mentioning things like light tables are actually very easy to make. It's really just a glass box or a box with a glass panel. Could be an old window frame with a light underneath, and normally you paint that glass white so it's opaque and not so bright. He also doesn't need a full drawing board with the different arms that can be attached straight into different angles. He could be using a simple T-square or slide rule drawing board. And it's really quite amazing, as we've gone through in previous videos, the geometry that we start seeing. There's references to the Zodiac crosshairs in so many different things, so it doesn't really mean that much, but just amazing to see that consistency of what can be done with simple set squares and a T-square to achieve vast and technical geometry. but also just how overarching the Zodiac symbol is in terms of mathematics and that geometry. And again, if Zodiac was some kind of drafter or had experience with this, it's probably likely that he had some kind of toolkit to keep this equipment in. And I've always wondered, where would he keep his letters and his documentation before sending it off or while he's preparing it? This geometry is highlighted in several of his letters, such as the ones relating to the Phillips map, where he emphasizes certain details which a lot of other people have gone through in potential locations. But I just find it interesting that there's just a flow through, between landscape architecture, gardens, electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, camshafts, and even in symbology, such as the copper. There's so many things line up. Again, I don't know if that's intentional by Zodiac. He could be just basing this off the watch, the Zodiac watch, and that alone, or from previous mystery and true crime films he's seen in the past. But it's just amazing that out of any profession, drafting and design and engineering really relate strongly back to this geometry. And this is what Zodiac was doing in all of this time. While he was creating his persona, his identity, creating these crimes, using these multimedia approaches, was quite unique in a way. And in this video, I'm going to go through a number of details where I draw out more information, look at examples, and hopefully take you on a journey that is not just about my theories, which that's all they are. They're just theories. But also, it's good to look for old textbooks, old pictures, old diagrams. Kind of puts you in the 1960s and the 1950s, taking you back to an era where things weren't all done on AutoCAD and computers. They were all done by hand. And I think that's also important to recognize with Zodiac in terms of the law enforcement, because while it's a real shame that law enforcement couldn't do more or didn't have much evidence to work with, they were stuck in the old days as well, in the same way that you had to prepare plans by hand. Law enforcement didn't have computer databases to instantly go through and find out and sift through information. They had to do it manually with a lot of interviews. And when you've got 2,500 suspects and that many people calling in, and the Zodiac spreading his murder communications from Vallejo to Lake Berryessa and Presidio Heights, and then immediately going into ciphers and bus bomb diagrams talking about anarchy or terrorism, I think it's really quite remarkable. And just on that, I think I mentioned in the last video that it's really somewhat unique that he's gone from murders, killing couples in lovers' lanes or younger people, to then trying to blow up a bus full of kids. And I mentioned that it's kind of like terrorism, but maybe it's actually more like anarchy when we look at the era. There was so much talk about anarchy and anti-establishment, and that really the law enforcement were the terrorists, shooting people on campus at Kent State and at coming to marches weaponized. There's also the tie-ins to Vietnam War and that anti-war sentiment. And also in this video, I will go through a little bit of military towards the end of the film as well. And we'll have a look at that. But ultimately, if Zodiac was a designer, there's some logic to what he was doing. There's some examples and evidence in his drawings that we can go through. There's also a bit of bluffing and I think trolling from Zodiac, that he's putting together all this stuff, but it doesn't always work. I don't think he's a professional in the sense that this guy is a master, that he is a university lecturer, mathematician, or he's leading a practice of architects, or is building rocket ships as a mechanical engineer. There is that influence, there is that background, but how it all fits together is really quite interesting. I wanted to revisit the bombs and the explosive devices and just test that out more. In the last couple of videos, I went through some of the drafting that Zodiac's used in these bags of bombs next to the road. And let's just take a bit of a look back over the letter that he sent. This is the first bus bomb diagram. Now he's talking about one bag of fertilizer each. It's classic ammonium nitrate, fuel oil, ANFO explosives, very common, as he mentions. And there's 5 bags already. That's, a boot full of ammonium nitrate, plus all the stove oil. That's going to fill up your car. He then talks about a few bags of gravel dumped over the top. So he needs a shovel, I'm assuming, unless he's actually going to bring in ported gravel in. But let's say he's going to do this on the supposed slope or somewhere in the embankment, which again, as I went through last time, is kind of ridiculous in itself. It's just after doing pretty discreet murders, he's then going to spend all this effort and time preparing this at night, digging in 5 bags, and then talks about ventilation when it's essentially right near what would be a swale or the road shoulder. He also calls it a death machine, but there's not really any mechanical parts in this. It's more site planning and the road environment, electronic engineering, although the way these elevations are drawn out is quite typical of mechanical engineering. And a bit of a shout out to Drew Bearson, who's helped me enormously in researching, and he's done a lot of research into Don Chaney, who was a mechanical engineer. While there's not a lot of mechanical engineering in these diagrams, mechanical engineering really is kind of a backbone to all design and engineering. So while there's no machinery per se in these diagrams, it's more of a wiring apparatus that could still fall under the umbrella of mechanical engineering, or the lack of engineering, mechanical engineering in these diagrams could be something worth looking at or contemplating. So there is not really a machine. He calls it a death machine, but again, that sounds like a comic reference, or he's going into scary mode, not already mode. He then talks about he'd send pictures rather than doing a diagram. Now, that again could be a bluff, but I do wonder, given some of the other things I've come across, certainly a lot of people are into photography, but I do wonder if Zodiac was interested in photography just as a matter of course. With your flash guns and camera technology, it seems like it's the sort of thing that Zodiac probably would be into. Also, just this description, my masterpiece. He's very egocentric. It's not the death machine, it's my masterpiece. He's very focused on himself, and again, he's not really looking at this competition or the reality of what he's doing. I don't think he has enough experience in explosives and demolitions to do that. He's again hodging together a lot of information here. Again, he talks about the clock having a battery for a year, but it only needs 12 hours for the clock hand to go round. On copper coils, which I spoke about in the last videos, that I don't think that's particularly efficient. He then talks about the photoelectric switch, which is over here, and the light source. which we will go to in more detail later. The 6-volt car battery, fairly standard stuff. Interestingly, he talks about a car battery. I guess that's what he needs to power all of this, including the torch in a way. He's got the torch connected up there as well. I don't know if the torch is really going to be running off a car battery or whether it's got its own ever-ready Duracell type batteries. That's sort of a little bit bizarre to contemplate unless he was thinking about an industrial light. But again, that costs money and is not as ready available as some of those things. So much easier to trace him on industrial products. He's then got the mirror. Doesn't talk about any kind of reflective mirror in there. He does in the torch. He talks about the reflector in the torch, but I'm assuming that just means the torch bulb housing, but not an actual photoelectric sensor that has ripples on it or a textured surface that can deal with pulses or light frequencies. And then this is really quite funny, cardboard tubes. Why they have to be 18-inch. I get it. He's trying to focus in. He's sighting in on the mirror and the bus. But a torch in daylight's just really not going to have the incandescence or illumination to get across very effectively when you consider all the variables of this road environment that is quite large scale. And then black shoe polish on the inside of a cardboard tube. What if it rains and these tubes get wet? How the tube's held up? There's no talk about that. I think he's full of shit. He does know some stuff, like the unconnected circuit we see here. And just interesting, if I look at the dimension, the angle here, it's 30 degrees, but it's not completely perpendicular up the page. It looks like an isosceles triangle. A lot of electronics diagrams tend to draw these triangles in at equilateral triangles, but the angles either way are a consistent 70 and 80 degrees. So it looks like he's set this up in the same way as the rest of the diagram via a drawing board to get those dimensions. And we'll go through some possibilities where this diagram may have come from. In some ways it's very simple. It looks like, the bombs are in series, but it looks like a parallel circuit or wiring diagram. And there may be a number of explanations of where he's got this information from. So in general, electronics drafting, what we have here is essentially an array of bombs, similar to what you'd see on a modern chip. It's an array of circuits, or what we'd see in an amplifier circuit. It's an array of different amplifiers and converters and rectifiers. And then we can see here from a car diagram, we have the not connected symbols next to what are the different inputs of the circuits. This hex buffer circuit's kind of interesting because it has the little arrows shown, and we have the little dots on top. That essentially is an array or references back to the string of bombs. Now, the string arrangement is also something that we see quite often used in engineering and design. I've used string quite a lot just to describe things like we will do a string of developments along the waterfront, for example. In engineering, it's used for a number of applications, and in electronic engineers, it's especially used, and we see that coming through into computer science, where we have a string or a sequence of items, which in Zodiac's case is the bombs. And this string arrangement we can also see in things like electricity poles and wires, the insulation or insulators for those high voltage cables. And interestingly, we also have this similar triangular symbol throughout in a lot of electricity poles and systems, and that's also quite similar. And again, it's really an array or a string of elements that are put together. So an array of wires, an array of information, an array of switches. It could be applicable to a lot of different contexts. But let's have a look at demolitions and blast engineering, because that's going to be probably more focused towards what we're looking at here. Now, whether it's mining or to blast out a ditch for a road, for example, we find some similar documentation in this array of bombs or an array of explosives. And from this book here, Rock Blasting Explosive Engineering from the Era, we can see probably a very close system to what Zodiac's done. Again, Zodiac's got the two lines going through on his loop, on his wiring loop. So it appears like it's parallel like this, although he's drawn it more like this off to the side. But here's the thing, the one thing that he never mentions at all is blasting caps, or how he's going to detonate that. Now, he could be alluding to that with these ends. Are they the bags, or is that an actual blasting cap? But he goes into enough detail to talk about an 18-inch cardboard tube with black shoe polish on the inside, but fails to mention the blasting cap or the detonation device. And even Arthur Lee Allen, when his home was raided and they found pipe bombs underneath in his basement, they found blasting caps. So at least that was kosher in that regard. And blasting caps are really important because you can't just have wires going into a bag of ammonium nitrate and stove oil and gravel. There needs to be some kind of actuator to prime and detonate this device. So even in the Kurt Saxon time bomb, you can see that there's a filament similar to what you'd find in a light bulb that detonates the device. And again, that simplicity of this switch, far more less complicated than what Zodiac does. Now, blasting caps might be difficult to get hold of, but again, they could be made from a smaller explosive, some black powder, a stick of dynamite, a filament. In commercial applications for doing demolitions or mining and bulk earthworks blasts, the detonating equipment is really quite complex. And it's also interesting that when these detonators are laid out, they're more called rows rather than string. So while Zodiac has used a string of bombs, which is fairly common in the engineering and design world, in actual blast engineering, they're called rows, as they're put into the rocks to explode. And they all have a very, very complex electric system. And a lot of commercial applications of blasting usually have time delays. There's an enormous amount of protocols. There's an enormous amount of variables to cater for, which I don't think Zodiac has. It's highly risky, particularly to himself, that when he sets this whole bum diagram up, he could be caught in the blast as he's setting it up. So you've really got to get that mechanism for exploding the device from the electronic circuit right. And the fact that Zodiac doesn't even mention blasting caps is kind of odd. It's also worth noting that in the late 60s, the IRA were doing a lot of bombings, and it's possible that Zodiac was aware of this or other bombings, as well as the underground movement, and picking up things like Kurt Saxon or similar diagrams. And these are two RA bomb diagrams. One's using an alarm clock, very simple compared to Zodiac's, and this one's using the Kurt Saxon method of just 2 connections, and somewhere within a 12-hour system the clock connects the circuit up a lot more simply than what Zodiac's showing here. And we can see some of those time bombs battery powered here, and then again here we can see the load initiator, the filament, or some kind of explosive cap that detonates the bomb. It's also worth noting that at any time in this diagram, anywhere in this system, Zodiac could have put in an arming switch, something to disconnect, and then he can come along at any time and switch it on so it works. And also interesting to see some of his language during this bomb era. Straight after Paul Stein's murder, he's going a bit nuts, whether he was scared that he almost got caught, and he's doubling down and just sending this out to the ether that he's going to become bigger and badder, and he's going full terrorist anarchy to try and divert attention away from himself or his location or whatever. But this idea that if I hold too back long, I'll lose control. Please help me. I can't remain in control much longer. Yet, compared to what's around in the area, his bomb is a little bit haphazard. I don't think he's thought through every part of this. Again, I think he's winging it. So the bus bomb diagram layout, the wiring and how it's all put together, the array of bombs, it's very similar to wiring harnesses and relays that one might find in something like a car. Just an interesting thing when I was going through a lot of this detonation cabling and the sequence of wires from textbooks, friction tape keeps coming up. Now, friction tape, of course, is used a lot in wiring looms, like for racing, and we know certain people involved in the case had some interest in car races, such as at Riverside and Vallejo, and the diagram that the Zodiac has drawn up is very, very similar to wiring harnesses we'd find in cars. So it's kind of interesting. I don't really know if the 1978 letter that mentions friction tape, I don't think it's authenticated, but it's sort of fascinating that when you look at this in more detail, the bus bomb diagram and its circuitry or its wiring loom, so to speak, it's very similar to what we might find in vehicles. And we can see that here again. These are actually some wiring diagrams from late 50s, early 60s Chev Impalas, and we can see we have that same open connection as each of parts of the wiring loom are going to the series of engine cylinders and distributor. And we can see here again that same layout, that array with those pointed triangular drafting, thin, and also a little bit off keel. We talked about that before, being 70 and 80 degrees, the angles between these triangles, and here it almost seems like it's vertical with an angle. And we can also see the same thing in a lot of boat wiring harnesses as well. This is for a power boat, so it's quite interesting. There's also interesting to see how some of that documentation or electrical engineering drafting changes. In the 1961 Chevrolet, we have lots of these little not connected symbols with a little kind of bridge going over, the little semicircle. I don't have it shown up here, but in 1964 it changed to straight crossing over, kind of like what you can see here, where there's not that little semicircle. They're all just going straight over the top of each wire. So it's interesting that in 1969, Zodiac's either referencing older wiring diagrams or older textbooks, not using the modern approach to not connected wiring. It's also really interesting to look at knots within electrical engineering and wiring. It's not just for military or Boy Scouts or sailing. There's an enormous amount of knot tying and different types of knots that are required for wiring, and you can see this here on the right with the space program machinery and electronics all cabled up and with the friction tape holding it together, no different to a car wiring system. On the second bus bomb diagram, Revision B, it's also interesting that he's used a timer instead of a clock this time. He's simplified his diagram, and in fact he's simplified the diagram overall so he doesn't show any detail. He's really pulled back on his drafting and he's made this almost like a Gantt chart. So he's done away with showing any detail, and he doesn't go through his whole lists. He just talks about the A and the B boxes, and it's kind of fascinating that, again, what kind of timer is he using? Is he just referring back to a clock, a timepiece, or is he meaning a timer like we see over here, which is sort of an old vintage kitchen timer that would have 60 minutes. We also have here a vintage 12-hour timer, so he could utilize one of these old timing systems. And then in terms of the cloudy day disconnect, that's another piece of equipment that, while available at the time, he's moving away from more practical solutions, and to make that work within this environment, I think could be quite difficult. And he's assuming that everything can be powered by this one 6-volt car battery. It's really a bit out there. But he talks about this and talks about things not going off by accident. He talks about blast. He has this capability to draw in engineering, some blast engineering, some landscape architecture and civil engineering. He has the electronics components in various bus bomb diagrams. So he's clever in how he puts it all together. But given the timing straight after Paul Stein's murder, I think he's really having a bit of fun with these diagrams. And I think it actually both reveals a number of things. One, some of his background in drafting and how he's revising and laying out this works. His masterpiece, that he calls it, that takes 2 revisions to get right, and it's still not quite right. But I just find some of the language and the geometry that's been used, the evidence of using drawing boards for the drafting is significant. And it's really easy to look back in hindsight with access to the internet that he didn't have at the time. But I think there's quite a lot of discrepancies in his diagrams under closer interrogation. Alright, so I wanted to come back to the photoelectric switches and photoelectric sensors that the Zodiac talks about, and that in combination with the flashlight bulb and reflector, which I assume means a torch. I don't think it means a flash bulb from a camera. It seems more like a constant light. So when we look at the first and second bus bomb diagrams, we have revision A and we have revision B in a way. And it's kind of interesting how he's updated and I suppose improved upon his design, although it's still quite flawed. In the last video, we went through this idea that he may have used or been inspired by photo relays and photoelectric sensors that were commonly seen in electronics magazines, such as the detector ray or this photoelectric relay system by Archer. There were also in some of the electronics magazines diagrams to make your own infrared sensors. And you could see that there's quite a lot of discourse at this time in magazines around sensing systems. They'd been around since the 40s or earlier. However, in the 60s there were some technological improvements, including the use of LEDs and infrared, and we also saw things like the ultrasonic eye coming in with Cadillacs for high beams, different types of sensing systems both for commercial and home use. And it's interesting that in the first bus bomb diagram he's using this torch with a long cardboard tube, which I don't think he really needs, and a mirror. So here he's providing his own light source, but then he talks about having some kind of photoelectric sensor or switch here to trigger the mechanism. And it kind of baffles me a little bit, because if he was going to go out and buy a sensor that takes something for a mirror, why not buy two whole units that are a complete system rather than using a torch? And then in the second diagram, he doesn't away with the torch or even having any light at all. He relies on the sun. And then he has his sensor switch here and what he calls a cloudy day disconnect. The way he's drawn these long tubes that he describes as cardboard tubes with black shoe polish on the inside, again, I don't think there's any consideration of the reality of the site, the road environment he's dealing with here. A cardboard tube would get wet with one dew or with rain and could collapse in on itself. He doesn't really need it. The idea of this torch working in the early morning when the bus goes by, there's just too much diffused light for this to happen with that kind of torch. But the long tubes that he's drawn does remind me a little bit of very early, I guess, precursors to photoelectric sensors, photo tubes that were sometimes used in movie audio production and early sensing. You can see from these Archer photoelectric sensors, the receiver and the transmitter, the light is really not that powerful, as you can see in this image in the top right. It's almost like a slideshow projector. There may have been more powerful industrial application lights that could transmit across a two-lane road, but I think given all the variables in this road environment, I'm doubtful that that could actually work given the true applications of photosensors in industry. Now we can see here that even he bought a long beam focusing torch, and let's say he bought a really high one at 700 foot, and in the late 1960s, I don't really know how powerful torches really would be to go across a road environment like this and hit a mirror and then back into a sensor. And in the second diagram, he's indicating that he'd have a cloudy weather disconnect, which again, there's a number of types of disconnects, from industrial to smaller units. But again, his first bus bomb diagram, he's talking about having it all set up. It's ready to go. He's done tests, so we presume he's bought some of this equipment. He's then going to go and buy more equipment to get the cloudy disconnect. and that's another type of sensor altogether. So he's now relying on his light source to be the sun. That would be a through beam to A, which would be the sensor. Also interesting just the way he's drawn the torch up here in the first bus bomb diagram, that it looks very similar to electronics engineering diagrams for speakers. So the concept of photoelectric sensors in Zodiac's bus bomb diagram is fairly simple. It's really having some kind of beam, the sunlight or the torch, and as the bus bomb goes through, it triggers the photoelectric sensor to then switch on or form a connection. Now, even in the late 60s, they were starting to get into LEDs, light emitting diodes, and reflector panels that could be calibrated to different light pulses or frequencies. That was all available. So was infrared, was available back in the late 60s. So I don't know, I kind of get the impression he's fudged together a few things that he knows about, either from popular electronics magazines, through cars and their sensing devices that were starting to come in the 60s, or through home security and industrial applications with photoelectric sensors. But why he didn't really look into, if he was going to purchase a sensor to take in the torch or the sunlight, why not just buy a complete kit? And at that time, he probably could have bought an early infrared or LED reflector kit. So there's a lot of problems with this photoelectric sensor layout. Again, like I said before, it's mostly used in industrial applications in a short scale, i.e. immediately, like a door opening, elevator door, photoelectric switch for a light to come on at night. But in a road environment, you've just got so much more variables that it makes it incredibly difficult, including solar reflections and that ambience. And I'm just not convinced on that road environment that a torch would be good enough, even if he's got a tube to focus it, as he says, that's got black shoe polish on the inside. I don't think that would really make a difference. I think the big problem is so much of photoelectric sensors, particularly at the time, wouldn't have been that powerful. They're much more suited to smaller beam projections, such as in a factory. And these are the different types of beams. You got through beam, which supposedly can go up to 100 meters. And that's essentially what Zodiac's using in the second bus bomb diagram, except his light source is the sun. He also talks about this, having a mirror, but he doesn't use a retroreflector sensor, which has got some texture on it for pulses or light frequencies. Diffuse sensors are much more applicable, again, to the factory environment where you're sensing small objects in close proximity to the sensor. So I really don't think across the whole bus bomb diagram layout that Zodiac's done, whether it's revision A or his supposedly improved revision B, there's a lot of problems, particularly around what types of photoelectric sensors he's showing and the road environment variables. Now, similar to how we went through some of the vocabulary of engineering like string, the way that Zodiac used a string of bombs, and that being consistent with a lot of engineering language as well as computing language in the modern era, to describe a sequence of items, which are the bombs in Zodiac's case. I thought it's also interesting to look at this word slaves. Now, slaves has all sorts of connotations and could be used in multiple different contexts. We'll never really know exactly what Zodiac meant by this. I sometimes think that he meant with his slaves, metaphorically, his victims are going to be in the media and have infamy or fame for the rest of his life, and that's happened in the case. In so many other serial killer cases, the victims aren't really talked about that much, or the locations of the crimes. But in Zodiac, because he was quite intense in his 1 year spree, most people in the case know so much about the victims. They know so much about the crime scene locations, and it's just a personal idea, but I sometimes think that maybe it wasn't so literal with the slaves, but it was this metaphor for those victims of his are going to be continually dragged up in the media. The other thing, though, is it comes across in a lot of terminology to do with engineering. I probably heard first about slaving to do with guitar amplifiers, where you can slave a preamp to a power amp via a dummy load. But we'll see in many applications of engineering, there is this idea of slave. Like here we have a slave walkie-talkie that essentially just receives. We have strobe light slaves for photography, and we have slaves in mechanical engineering for objects and services. What is the master, the target, and what is the slave? As well as also in electronics engineering that carried through into computer science, where modern day computers have master and slave environments. So there may not be much in this, but it just in so many things that I keep looking through, I keep coming across this word slave, and it's something that I've sort of forgotten about myself in how that's used. There may be no correlation to what Zodiac's doing. It may be completely spiritual, what he's looking at. Who knows? But just interesting to pick up on the engineering and mechanics behind master-slave systems. While we're on the Halloween card, I thought it was also just interesting to note how the Zodiac has really had quite a bit of focus and detail in copying the boo and copying the font that's used on the card. And not just from this card, because here the lettering is quite thin, but we can see on other similar Secret Pal cards this wavy lines that we have, and that's picked up in many of these Halloween and Secret Pal cards. Just an interesting little note that it certainly shows an attention to detail, and that he's mimicking, again, he's copying. He's not using an original font. He's not doing his own Halloween card from scratch. He's utilizing information that's already there. And like many other people, I've looked high and low for this particular skeleton online, and I cannot find it anywhere, along with the pumpkin. Hopefully it'll turn up somewhere, because maybe it gives more of a clue. And if it is really rare, where did it come from? It'd be quite interesting. Maybe it came from overseas, and that's why it's not online as accessible as it could be. So I'll keep searching. If anyone finds it, let me know. Back to the bus and the cars. One thing I wanted to pick up on with these sections again, just to demonstrate how Zodiac, while he's changed his revisions of the bomb diagram and the layout, he's still paid particular attention to these sections. In the first bus bomb diagram, revision A, He's got the bus coming towards us, the car off to the side, so front headlights, large windscreen. In the second bus diagram, he's flipped the profile around to look the opposite way, so he's got the rear of the bus, or at least that's what it looks like to me, and that's what would configure these sections to be accurate to each other. If they were flipped around, the bus is coming towards you, bus going away. Also, just note this little mistake that he's done in here. It could be just he's drafting as he's going through. He's gone over the line, a bit similar to the sun. He's not so neat. But it also could be similar to what he's doing with his writing and coming up with spelling mistakes and silliness in his text. The same could come through in his drawing. Another quick look at text. I mentioned last time that I felt that it was 1/4 inch graph paper that was likely used. This is due to the fact that you get nice even spacing between the characters, and particularly for the ciphers where you've got the box, and you can see that it generally works really well with this cipher, but my name is cipher is a little bit out, but you can see it still generally works in. So I'm not sure if he's used graph paper behind for this one, but it certainly looks like he's used graph paper behind here as well. You can also see I haven't done a full investigation of this, but at least from this little bit of text and also through here, although it's a bit looser on this one and the scales might be a bit out, he's got pretty even spacing between his lettering. And while he didn't use lined paper, it looks like he's done these lettering over graph paper as a guide. Makes me wonder whether he's used the light table also to do a lot of his letters, or at least particularly letters that are very neat, where they go across in parallel lines, and especially where he's got a cipher. Now, as I mentioned, the reason why the 1/4 inch graph paper is so good versus 1/5 of an inch or 1/4. The 1/5 of an inch, really have to divide it into 10. You could do it in 2-inch squares, or like we see in some drafting, you could do a mix of 2/5 of an inch and 3/5 of an inch to get different spacing, so it's narrower between the lettering. But there are these lettering guides. I never really used them much when I was younger drafting, but they're common on different types of equipment, including a standalone thing that can be arranged to get any dimension you want from these tiny little circles that you put your pencil through and do your guidelines. And that allows you to create guidelines outside of graph paper if you don't have that as a backing, so that you can do your lettering in between and with those guidelines rather than in a floating box. So there is the possibility that he didn't use graph paper at all and he just drew up his own graph or guidelines behind. But I think it'd be far easier for him to grab a sheet of commonly used 1/4 inch graph paper, which is actually in some of these textbooks. The old technical drawing textbooks has that as one of the dimensions for lettering. We've gone for a lot of engineering design, but could Zodiac just be an illustrator? Just simply someone who could draw? Well, very possibly. We know that there's a lot of comic book references throughout Zodiac's communications, including Red Rider, where there's some influence of possibly cattle brands. Also interesting in this Red Rider map, the use of fletched arrows for location, which is we've gone through before, but is quite interesting that it's used quite a lot in old 50s and 60s diagrams like this, also in maps for a North Point. And as we saw in the bus bomb diagram, Zodiac's used it identically to show movement, like technical drawing. And we can see even in this comic that whoever the illustrator is has great detail in drawing environments, buildings, and quite a lot of illustrators do cross over into design and engineering. We know from the videos that I've been doing that engineering, design, landscape architecture, electronics engineering all require aptitude in being able to draw and illustrate. The better you can draw, the more precise your drafting is going to be, or the more clearly and legibly you can visualize what you're designing for your client or for the community. So it's kind of interesting that you have this illustrative skill within design and engineering and drafting, but there are also graphic designers out there, and it has come up a few times that people think Zodiac works in print media. I personally don't really believe this. He's used a lot of stick-on labels. They look like they've been done identically to drafting of plans and documentation. But of course, quite a lot of drafters who don't have a degree in engineering or architecture, or graphic designers who might be working for different clients, will often have to do illustrations for textbooks or for diagrams, whatever it may be. So it's worth looking at people who are illustrators as well. In the 60s in San Francisco, of course, everything was exploding with the Fillmore and acid tests and the San Francisco kaleidoscope of counterculture, collage and mixed media, and of course across North America and the world, pop art, this return to Art Nouveau. There was a lot happening in graphic design, in illustration, in art and sculpture and fine arts, and in the media as well. And there were some highly skilled people back in the day, you know, like Rick Griffin and R. Crumb, the fabulous Furry Freak Brothers, all the crew from the underground press in the Berkeley Barb. Their illustrations are just really incredible. So Zodiac was in this environment where all this was going on. I personally don't see a lot of graphic design ability or that pure illustration ability in Zodiac. I think it's more a drafter who can draw rather than the other way around. So it's easier for a drafter to have some graphic or illustrative skills than an illustrator or graphic designer to understand engineering and blast detonations and road engineering sections, that sort of thing. We do know from Zodiac he had links to comics. This is very well known, whether it's Batman or mystery or all true crime comics. There's several references back there. So again, it may have been someone who was into comics as a hobby or as a passion that helped fuel the fantasies of Zodiac, or it could have been someone who was actually involved in the preparation of comics, and through preparing comics and that background had crossed over into parts of design and engineering. It's also interesting, as I spoke before, about the cards and how they're almost all pen and ink, or they're all by artists, including Crumb. And of course, he's got an incredible touch with his pen and ink, and he used the card, sorry I haven't written, but I just washed my pen, which was drawn by R. Crumb. Very hard to find the original drawing of that. What's interesting about some of R. Crumb's drawings here, I just put them up, is just the use of whiteout over this original drawing, similar to how Zodiac has used some white paint or possibly even whiteout on the Halloween card. So certainly within the realm of someone who's an illustrator, but personally I think it still leans towards drafting and design documentation. Now, outside of the Wingwalker boot prints that were found, there's not really a lot to connect Zodiac with the military. And I've said in the past that I don't think he's a military guy, at least not directly. One, due to the fact that I think he's more of a mature age student or a younger man. He's not a high school kid. He's not straight into service. I don't think he's old enough to be World War II. I don't think he's got that angst of someone coming back from Vietnam. It seems to me that he's created this persona more around cultural influences and true crime influences. However, there could be connections such as family members, brothers or sisters. Maybe he's done a couple of years in the army. But the army's not just all about bombs and explosives and all that sort of stuff. There's also the drafting and engineering and design aspects. Now, of course, military operations in America are so huge, it's almost its own world. And it's not necessarily just people in the military, but could be subconsultants and contractors. So I just want to quickly explore through some old field manuals and design reports and guidelines from the military and see what we can dig up. There's plenty of opportunities in the military to use illustration skills. This illustration up here with a pontoon bridge is almost like a 50s comic book. So whoever's drawn this is either an illustrator or an engineer or designer that has the talent to be able to draw and visualize this diagram. The same with this road diagram through here. And a lot of military is temporary works, but there are larger projects like, for example, Treasure Island in San Francisco. We also have diagrams here in military guidebooks and field manuals that require expert illustration, cross sections, and this detailing. So it really covers quite a large tract of expertise. We can see some similarities with the bus bomb diagrams. The first bus bomb diagram here, I found this interesting railway line with an explosion going off to detonate the carriage, as we can see here, which is kind of familiar. And then of course the graded, raised and round and crowned road sections, demolition work, and here with the second bus bomb diagram section that we've already demonstrated is copied from landscape architecture grading textbooks, but of course may originate in much older textbooks such as these, and these are probably all general engineering and road grading, civil engineering plans. So in all these handbooks and different guidelines and principles, we find evidence, of course, of drafting and design, military's huge operations. There's also the aspect of reconnaissance and survey, which could be useful in picking up things like use of radians or mapping that someone like a mechanical engineer or electrical engineer may not normally get around to doing. I thought this little rocket tube in here was kind of interesting, very similar to the bus bomb diagrams and how they're drawn, maybe a possible influence. And then there's just the overall approach and requirement for infantry divisions and layout, conflict resolution, different barracks, housing for defence and their families, requires master planning, infrastructure, mechanical, electrical, just like any other civilian or commercial project. And that goes through from site planning to block and section layouts that we spoke about in the first video. Here's a landscape plan as well. Housing allotments, urban design, urban planning, lighting plans. So I'm not super convinced that Zodiac was in the military active for a long time, that he's a wild nut, ex-Vietnam Rambo sort of dude. I still tend to think he's more of a office or studio kind of guy. But maybe he was involved in the military via these projects as a sub-consultant or directly in the military, and as a result that could cover some of the breadth of his expertise, from technical drawings through to crafts and illustrations through to mapping, similar to what I went through before in some of my previous videos with landscape. But really fascinating stuff, and actually really cool fun to look over all these old diagrams. So there we go.